Once again, I'd like to introduce Doug Brouwer. He is a HASP member and world traveler and has journeyed extensively throughout his life with large groups and solo. And Doug has led mission trips, study tours, pilgrimages, and 3 times he has lived abroad for extended periods. His latest book, called The Traveler's Path, is a reflection on those experiences and a guide for making travel better than it often can be. He received his BA from Calvin, an MDiv and DMin degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary. Once again, Doug Brouwer.
Thank you, Cindy. As you know, I was hoping I didn't scare anyone away last time because I told you all the problems with travel. Steve and Jean Norden were so excited by my first presentation that they're now in Amman. No, that's not it, is it? Amman? Okay. Oh, you already know? Okay. So the first week, I introduced travel as a far bigger subject than most of us are aware, and I included all human movement and history in that first week. And then last week, I zeroed in on the problems with travel, and I used Agnes Callard as my, what would you say, foil. And the truth of the matter is I agree with Agnes Callard about a great deal, but I'm going to push back today on one issue, and that is I think that travel can and has changed many, many people, and I'm going to give examples of that, all right? So we're not going to let Agnes Callard have the last word. My usual disclaimer is that sometimes a vacation is just a vacation. I've done plenty of that in my life. Those getaways are necessary. A few days at the lake, this was when I didn't live at the lake, a few days at the lake could be restorative. So I get that. On the other hand, sometimes travel under the right circumstances, we'll get to that. Sometimes travel can be profoundly life-changing. Sometimes things can happen to us that we did not anticipate. Last week, filling in for Cindy was Pat Locke, and she talked very briefly about her own experience of life change. She was on a Greece-Turkey pilgrimage with me, and one day we stopped near the ancient city of Philippi, and there's a stream there where Lydia, this, according to the book of Acts, the seller of purple cloth, was baptized along with her family. And Pat had what I discovered later. I didn't realize it was going on at the time, but what I discovered later was a profound spiritual experience. So she went back to the Chicago area where we lived, quit her job, and started seminary and became a Presbyterian pastor. Something happened there that day to her as we reflected on the story about Lydia. I told you the story of Susan Drinan, an executive with GE. She and I and 30 some other people met a Palestinian priest in Galilee, and she decided in that moment that she wanted to spend the rest of her life raising money for Father Shakur's Vision for Peace in Galilee. But there are others, and I'm going to go through 4 stories today, which I describe in more detail in my book. And then I've got a few more to add to it that I kind of wish I had included in the book, but let's take a look at these. All right. Anyone familiar with the name Mary Kingsley? Not a household name, maybe. Mary Kingsley grew up in Great Britain, England. And this was at a time when women didn't do much traveling at all, and they certainly did not travel alone. So she was about 30 years old and received news that her father had fallen seriously ill in West Africa, where he was doing a bit of traveling and study and so on. And so she made the decision, again, age 30, single woman. She went to West Africa to be with her seriously ill father. Something happened while she was there. Her eyes were opened about West African culture, and she devoted what turned out to be the rest of her life. She died too young, but she devoted what turned out to be the rest of her life to learning the culture of West Africa. She learned the languages that were spoken there. And I think this is the most remarkable thing. She viewed the West African people and culture not through colonial eyes, which is how most people at her time of life did. At her, I don't know how I want to express that, but she developed a deep appreciation for who these people were, what they valued, and so she wrote movingly about all of that. Mary Kingsley, good name to know. Rachel Carson. As it turns out, Rachel Carson went to college and got a bachelor's degree in science of some kind, and then went to work for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. I don't know if that still exists. And then while she was working for the Bureau of Fisheries, she wrote a book called The Sea Around Us. Silent Spring was not her first book, but The Sea Around Us became a bestseller in 1955, and she won the National Book Award for that book. But that's not what she's known for. At some point, after the publication of that earlier book, she booked herself a cruise. It was not a Viking River cruise, or it was a scientific voyage. She wanted to see for herself the effects around the world of synthetic pesticides. So I forget how old she was exactly, but she took this cruise, came back, and wrote a manifesto. I think it was published, an early version of this was published in the New Yorker, and then it became, it became a book, and that is the book we all remember her for. She is a remarkable person. When the book appeared, of course, pesticide companies were very, very critical of it, and they complained that she didn't have a PhD. She was merely a college graduate. But she went to see for herself the effects that pesticides were having on the environment. And so the gift, she didn't have a PhD, but she had the gift of communication. She told her story very, very effectively. All right, Rachel Carson. Jack Kerouac. When I first read On the Road, I did not put him and my father together, but actually they have a lot in common. My father was also a World War II veteran, served in the United States Navy, and also was very curious about the world, but that's where the similarity ends. When my dad came back from World War II, he met my mom and started a family. Worked for the same company for 40 years. That's not Jack Kerouac's story. As some of you know, when he came back from World War II, and maybe this was his way of dealing with trauma, whatever his war experiences were, I don't know, but he began crisscrossing mainly the United States, experiencing what few of us get to experience in a lifetime. He did some of his travel by hitchhiking. He took rails. He kind of a hobo in a way, I guess. He inspired a generation. I would include myself in that. Reading On the Road was kind of a life-changing experience for me. I don't think he made the world a better place in the same way that Rachel Carson did, but he inspired people like me to want to travel. I read his stories and I thought, man, I would like some of that, folks. Any Jack Kerouac fans here? No. Oh, okay. He's kind of old now. I mean, now this one is going to surprise you, I predict. When white people hear about Malcolm X, they don't always have warm, positive feelings. But let me tell you, let me give you another way to think about this. Malcolm X became a Muslim, black Muslim, when he was serving a prison sentence in Massachusetts. And he became a very devout follower of the Nation of Islam, and eventually became, because of his personal gifts, became close to Elijah Muhammad. In the academic year 1975-76, I was a student prison chaplain at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. And I would observe groups of black men who were joining the Nation of Islam. joining the Nation of Islam gave them pride, purpose, and more. I mean, it was no surprise to anybody who was there that a young black man from the streets of Philadelphia would want to be a part of the Nation of Islam. When they went to the dining hall, they would march together with, it was kind of scary too, with a young white boy from Grand Rapids to be, mixing in the prison population with them. But I could see what the attraction was. They needed an identity, and Islam gave them the identity that they were looking for. Okay, so that's Malcolm X's background and story. At some point in his life, I don't know the full story, he had a break with Elijah Muhammad and decided to go his own way. The Nation of Islam did not encourage these pilgrimages to Mecca, which are one of the 5 basic norms of Islam, that if you were a black Muslim, that was not a requirement for your faith. So as soon as Malcolm X separated from the Nation of Islam, where did he go? He went to Mecca and had a life-changing experience there. So I'm going to read, he's got a wonderful, it's not really a book length, it's a monograph called Letter from Mecca, and he writes, "Never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in this ancient holy land." So up until this point, he's been spouting racial separation and disparaging white people or people from any other race. And then he goes to Mecca and sees, these are my fellow Muslims, and I'm witnessing sincere hospitality, not just a peaceful coexistence, but something much deeper than that. The tragedy of this story is that Malcolm X did not live long enough to fully explore his experience. He was gunned down in New York City not too long after this. Right? Was that a familiar story to you? Okay. I have an appreciation for him, and it grows out of my own prison experience. I saw young men like Malcolm X, and I think I understood him. William Least Heat Moon. Some of you have read this. So in 1978, at the age of 38, his 10-year marriage comes to an end, and he lost his job, and he thought to himself, a man who can't make his life go can at least go. So he took his Ford van, christened it Ghost Dancing. He's the Native American by origin. And he traveled 13,000 miles around the United States, and he talked to everybody. It's just amazing to read this book. Sex workers in Nevada, but fishermen. I mean, you name it. He talked to everybody around the United States, and then wrote a beautiful account of what he had done. This book, I think I mentioned this the first week, is often used by pastors and spiritual directors, not because he's religious. He's not in any way that I know of. But this book is used for the training of spiritual directors as a way to engage, to teach people how to engage others in conversation about their lives. His conversations were not about him. He was empty. So he was learning from every single person he met. I've got a few more, but I want to ask you if you can think of any other famous writers, people in history who have traveled and have had life-changing experience. Oh.
I'm trying to remember the name of the guy, but he wrote the book The Walk Across America. And yeah, Jenkins was his name. Yeah, he was traumatized, I think, by Vietnam War, and he decided just to walk, and he walked across America, and he wrote about all the different experiences he was involved in as he did that. And interesting, ultimately, he was in Louisiana and he became a Christian at a big, what they called crusades back in those days.
Oh, Billy Graham.
Yeah, yeah,
And he wrote about his experience.
yes,
Yep.
yep.
Anybody else? Yes, I'm hoping you don't choose one of the ones that I have coming up.
I don't remember the details, but there was someone, an elderly man that lost his driver's license and he took his riding lawnmower on a trip and wrote about it later.
Oh, that's a great story. You don't need a driver's license to ride a mower. Well, as soon as I change the slide here, you're going to think, oh, yeah, why didn't I think of that? Our former president made 3 separate trips to Kenya before he became president. He was quite young the first time he went, well, college age. He went the second time with his fiancee, Michelle, and then the third time he went as a U.S. senator. This book, which in my opinion is beautifully written compared to his memoir, which is Michelle's memoir is much better than his. But this book is just beautiful. And I think the reason for that is that he describes his experience of going to Kenya, seeing his father's birthplace, and understanding the culture from which his father emerged. I mean, in some ways, that's a classic story of a young man wanting to know who his father is, why his father acted the way he did. But not everybody has a father who came from Kenya. So this makes his story unique and compelling. Che Guevara. There are no Che Guevara fans here, huh? Ernesto, I think that's his actual first name. Ernesto Guevara was a medical student, and one day he took off with a buddy, and they rode one motorcycle throughout South America. And this turned out to be a life-changing experience for Guevara. He left medicine behind and wrote about his experience in what has come to be known as the Motorcycle Diaries. He observed terrible poverty and inequality throughout South America. He saw how indigenous peoples were being exploited, and the experience radicalized. And we now know him as a buddy of Fidel Castro, and overthrew the regime, the old regime, Cuba. But that all began with motorcycle riding. James Baldwin, I confess that I have not done a great deal of reading, but I think this is an important story. James Baldwin was born at Harlem Hospital, and he became a novelist. His first novel was Go Tell It on the Mountain, highly regarded. But it was not until James Baldwin moved to Paris that his world opened up. He began to meet people from other cultures, and he began to see the United States and its racial relationships for what they were. So I think that Go Tell It on a Mountain emerges from within that experience, but then once he goes to Paris, he's able to see it from the outside. Much bigger worldview. And then he writes Notes of a Native Son, which is a far bigger kind of story. The fact that he was a gay black man in New York did not help. Because, he had some considerable obstacles to overcome in his life. Keep going. So, do you know where I took the Ernest Hemingway class here with Stefan Hemingway, former English faculty member here, and I learned a great deal about Hemingway that I did not know. One is that he grew up in northern Michigan. His father was a physician there, and he used to follow his father around. His father made calls delivering babies and so on. If Hemingway had stayed in northern Michigan, I don't think we would have read the books that have emerged from him. But Hemingway felt drawn elsewhere, spent a considerable amount of time, especially in Paris. And it was there that his writing style shifted from those early Nick Adams short stories, became something much different, more compelling, I think. It shifted his worldview. He was an ambulance driver during the Spanish Civil War. I mean, how could that not shape his worldview? He was injured, spent time in a hospital, and writes about it, of course. And then his African safaris are also just beautifully written. So I love Michigan. This has been a great place to retire, but if I were a young man like Ernest, I think I would want to go see the world, which is, well, I guess I identify with that in him. I was away for 40 years. Was anyone else in Stefan Hemingway's class about the Nick Adams short story? I was not an English major as an undergraduate, so to me that was a very important class. Keep going. Nelson Mandela. I don't think I took a group to South Africa one time, and then from Cape Town, we took a half-hour ferry ride to Robben Island, and I saw the prison cell where he was kept for 15 of the 25 years he was incarcerated. But I don't think I knew the backstory to all of that. Nelson Mandela did become radicalized at one point. That was because he traveled around Africa and saw nations that were emerging from colonial rule, and he saw what free Black life could look like. And he went back determined to change things in South Africa, and that's how he ended up in that prison cell on Robben Island. You didn't ask, but I'll tell you this part of the story anyway. The beautiful, moving part of your visit to Robben Island was to see the gravel pit, the work that there are actually 5 future presidents of South Africa who were incarcerated there. The work that they were given to do and required to do was making gravel and pounding rocks into dust. So day after day, they pounded rocks into dust. But they had a lunch break each day, and our guide, who had also been a prisoner inmate at this prison, our guide showed us where they all sat for lunch and said, this is where the new South African Constitution was. The African National Congress came into being. So our guide was on Robben Island. Our guide was a former prisoner, and all of the guides, as it turned out, were former prisoners, and they all lived in the housing of their old prison guard. So their families moved to Robben Island. They lived in those houses. Now, Robben Island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Any of you ever taken a 5-year voyage? You know, if you took a 5-year voyage, I think you'd want to write a book about it. And Charles Darwin had a life-changing voyage, the Galapagos Islands, I think. It was in the Galapagos Islands where I think that he had the profound insights that led to his theory of evolution based on natural selection. I've never been to the Galapagos Islands. But anybody here? Yes. Did you write a book about natural selection? No. I hesitate to put this one up because of what we've learned about Paul Gauguin of late, but he left Paris. I think it was a financial move more than anything, but he left Paris, left family behind there, moved to Tahiti, and his life in Tahiti changed his art. But now in recent days or years, we've heard about the way he exploited young women on this island. So I have a changed opinion about him, but his art continues to be beautiful. And it was his leaving Europe and going to a completely different culture that changed. Anybody want to say a word in defense of Doug? You're going to kick yourself for not thinking of this one. So Mother Teresa grew up in Albania, of all places. She became a nun in Ireland, but it was her visit at age 18 to India that changed her life. And like my friend Pat, she experienced this inner call. I know what I've been put on this earth to do. And at some point, she went back and spent the rest of her life working. She calls it the poorest of the poor, working among the poorest. This is really a wonderful story. And to my knowledge, she did not write about her experience. I think that her life spoke for itself. Okay, that's all I've got. I'm ready to move on unless you want to mention somebody else.
Two people from home brought up John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie.
Beautiful. That's a good one. Thank you. Oh, two people mentioned the same person. Okay. Marco Polo. You want to say something about that? Okay.
And if you've heard the story about Mary Jane Gold, who was born and raised in Holland, Michigan, it's interesting. She was a traveler and was in Paris when World War II broke out, and ended up that changed her life too.
I wish Agnes Callard could be here to hear our argument that travel can sometimes change us profoundly. So, last week I said I have 12 ways that travel could be more than it often is for us. I'm going to give you 8 today, and one of them I'm only half serious about, but I have 8 ways or steps for you to consider if you want to make travel more than it often is. I put this quote up last time, and I'm going to start here. I'll read it for you personally, because this is how I feel about it. Personally, I like going places where I don't speak the language, don't know anybody, don't know my way around, and don't have any delusions that I'm in control. Disoriented, even frightened, I feel alive. Awake in ways I never am at home. All of my senses suddenly come alert again, and I can see, hear, and smell. I'm almost afraid. I'm almost frightened that I put this up there, because there's a fair amount of risk taking that goes into feeling this way. And I think I've told you already the times I've gotten myself while traveling, but this is what's inside me. Get me out of everything I know, so I'm not in control, and then I think I'm going to learn something. I'll add a couple more to Mershaw's list. You have to be careful with this one, because you don't want to be too vulnerable in world travel. I think there are people who would be glad to take advantage of you, but recognize your need for help. Ask for directions, ask for advice. Within, using good judgment, be willing to be vulnerable in your travel situation. I would adopt the attitude before you leave home that every experience, even the bad ones, will be a potential learning experience. I had one of these grants one summer, a sabbatical grant. So my family and I went to Italy. My 2 teenage daughters went to Italy, and we saw everything there was to see in Italy. But our mantra before leaving was, whatever happens, even the bad stuff, whatever happens, we're going to learn something from. And fortunately, nothing, I don't remember anything bad happening to us. My wife and I had a fight outside of a cathedral one time that our daughters have never forgotten. But other than that, nothing bad happened. Here's a good one. Remember, yes.
I was wondering what the fight was about.
It's the same one. It's always one of two. No, I thought she was being too bossy, but then it made it especially bad because we were outside of Notre Dame Cathedral. Am I blushing? Isn't it always the same one or two? Okay, thank you for asking. This is very, very hard. The third bullet point here. This is so hard for Americans. But please remember when you're traveling that the American way of doing things is one way of doing things. But the rest of the world often has other ways of doing those things. So is our way the best way? Is their way the best? I don't know. But please remember to observe what the rest of the world does. Here's an example. Europeans seem to love traffic circles, rotaries, and Americans become paralyzed as they approach them. Well, there's a lot of data to support the use of traffic circles. I think they're better for the environment because people aren't idling, waiting for red lights and so on. Anyway, it's very easy when you're driving in Europe to be judgmental of European road design. Anyway, I've never become comfortable with traffic circles. It's scary. Okay, and then finally, this is a mantra of mine, be curious, open, alert, humble, and have a teacher. Right. I was going to tell a story there, and it puts down somebody I was traveling with. Okay, I'm going to tell this story anyway, because it really focuses on a teachable spirit. I had a group in Israel one time, and we had a guide an Israeli guides are very well trained, highly knowledgeable, and he gave us a lecture on mosaics. I forget where we were now, but he told us all about mosaics. Well, one of the people in the group taught art history or something at University of Michigan, and she took over mid-lecture. She did not like what the guide was saying, and she finished the lecture for him, and I think it showed in his demeanor for the rest of our tour. I think it would have been better just to learn what this man had to say about those. I didn't use a name, did I? So, okay, not everybody can get off the bus. My parents, who, you know, after they took me all around the United States on road trips, then when I left the house, then they got really adventurous and they would go everywhere. Within a year or a year and a half of Nixon going to China and hosting the leaders there, my parents were in China, seeing it for themselves. The thing is, they always went with a guide, and maybe at that point you would want a tour bus and a guide in China, but they never went anywhere off this continent without a guide, tour bus, and printed itinerary. And I don't know what that was about. I think they loved the safety of that. I'm not sure. And I asked my mom a lot of questions in the last year of her life, but that was not one I focused. I have a friend, Jeff, here in Holland, who's married to a person who can't walk long distances. They love to travel. And if I say to them, get off the bus, it's just not going to be possible. So there are often physical circumstances that prevent us from doing all the wandering around that I wish we could do. But it would be good for some of us to get off the bus.
In 2000, I went with Grand Valley State University to Australia. And we took a cruise on the river, I guess, somewhere, one of the first nights we were there. And at one of the stops, one of the geography professors got off the boat to walk back to the campus where we were staying. He had no idea where he was or how to get there, but that was his way of getting off the bus. And he arrived back at the campus about 4 in the morning but he knew those streets and he became very familiar with how the streets worked in Australia
Were
or
you-
Sydney. It was in Sydney.
I guess I'm trying to think of a country where I would never advise that, but, were you in a tour group?
University, yeah.
Yeah,
There were
okay.
36 of us.
Okay. As the tour host, which a role I've played many times, that would make me panicky.
Well, he was one of the hosts.
Oh, okay. Not a
Yeah.
good example then either. As the tour host, I became very anxious when people would decide to go off on their own. Well, I felt responsible for the safety of my group. Yes.
My husband had a very good friend who was an archivist at National Archives who had a birth defect that looked very much as though he were a thalidomide child, although he was not. And so he had great mobility problems and he wanted for some reason to go to Ireland. And so he asked my husband if he would go with him. And so they went, no itinerary, no anything. They flew into Dublin, rented a car, and took off. They had a wonderful 3 weeks, and a year later, Sandy was dead. And we were so glad that he was able to go.
And good for your husband for helping to make it. Okay. Yeah, I think I mentioned the first week that I sort of wanted to title my book, Get Off the Bus. I am so glad that we didn't do that because it would be terribly insensitive to the kinds of people I've been mentioning. Shall we go on? Step 2, meet people. I already talked last week about Father Shakur, now he retired Archbishop of Galilee. Life-changing for me, but the life change would not have happened if we had not spent significant time with this person, and Susan Drynan's life would not have changed if we had not spent significant time with him. So because he has the potential, he's a charismatic figure, because he has the potential to reach into the hearts of people he's speaking to. I took groups back each time, 6 or 7 times. We've made our way to where he lived, and he always had enough time to tell the group his story. So I guess I'm going to make you move again. I've got one example that I'm going to give you, but I'm curious to know if there's one person in your travels you've met who's had a life-altering effect on you. Doesn't have to be a retired archbishop. Try it.
I wouldn't say life altering, but back in the 70s, my husband and I did some really stupid things. A couple of times we drove down to Mexico for the summer and just, drove all around and went where we wanted to go. You'd never do that now. But anyway, one year on our way back, he had read a lot about Pancho Villa and knew there was a museum in the state of Chihuahua. So we found it, and older gentleman was in charge of the museum and took us around. They had the vehicle that Pancho Villa was assassinated in. There were bullet holes in it. And so it was very interesting. And then he said, "Would you like to meet the Senora Villa?" And we said, "What?" Well, Pancho Villa was married several times, but the government recognizes, I don't know if it was his first or his last wife. And she lived in a home behind the museum. And so he took us in there and we got to sit and chat with her for a while. And I have a picture of me with her. And, it was just amazing part of history in Mexico and then to be able to spend time with her.
Thank you. So here's my theory about that. Yes, it's fun to have our photos taken in front of the Eiffel Tower, let's say. but the strongest memories we take away are often those people we meet. And so I'm guessing you
Yeah.
could picture this.
I can't, well, I can even picture the dress she was wearing, you know,
Yeah.
and just sitting in what was her sitting room, so to speak, and the chair she was in, and
Yep.
you know, it's amazing experience.
I like that.
In 1993, my wife and I took our two kids to Australia for 3 weeks. And at one point, we traveled around New South Wales mainly with a rail pass. But at one point, we took a train from, anybody's been to Australia, from Sydney to Dubbo Junction, which is 7 hours out of Sydney. And then it's 9 hours on a bus from there going to Broken Hill. I don't know if anybody knows where Broken Hill is. It's a big copper mining area. And I got talking with a guy named Ted on the bus, and Ted got to explain to me that he was a widower. He was 67 years old. And he and this Aborigine fellow, but they live in this little dinky place. And he said their little place is only 20 by 20, but he had a neighbor that was 40 by 40. And then he had one neighbor that was 180 by 180. And finally I said, well, Ted, I don't understand Australian mile dimensions and this type of thing. He says, well, I'm using your number, miles. So if you think about the guy had 180 by 180, if anybody knows where M46 is up in Muskegon, goes over through Saginaw to Lake Huron. From there south to the Indiana-Ohio state line was his farm. And to think the impression of that, but to just meet people like that is just incredible. We came back on the Indian Pacific, which is their luxury passenger train across Australia. Wonderful ride if you get a chance.
I'm there. I'll go tomorrow. So I'm going to tell you my story here, since I already told you about Father Shakur last week. I love most things about being a pastor, not every single thing, but I love most things about it. And one of the things I love most was to come to a new congregation and discover the people who were sitting in the pews, and hearing their stories and finding out what remarkable people they really were. Well, in the last church I served in Zurich, I met a man named Pierre Spiori, and well, there he was on Sunday, and okay, another guy in the pews, until he invited me to his home, and then I got to hear the story. So I can see that you're reading his story. He grew up in Zurich, went to school in Geneva and Zurich, was a medical student until the end of World War II, and then medicine didn't hold the same attraction for him at that point, and he became aware of somebody named Frank Buchmann, who founded the moral rearmament movement. Does anybody recognize moral rearmament? Later, I think that name fell out of favor, and they changed it to Initiatives of Change. Well, moral rearmament was a response to World War II. And what happened was Frank Buchmann would gather people at a conference center in Kau, Switzerland, to talk to each other, but even more important, to listen to each other. This was their way of emerging from World War II, to bring people with very different ideas together so that they could learn to understand each other and get along with each other. And when my friend Pierre Spiori heard about that, he decided to devote his life to it. So not everybody leaves medical school at the end of all of that work for something like this, but Pierre did. And so early on, he traveled the world with Frank Buchmann. They put on conferences and so on all around. But then at a certain point, he and his wife ran the conference center in Kau, Switzerland, and wrote several books about his experience and all the people who were brought in. Well, I have to say, it was my privilege to get to know Pierre and Fulvia, right, and to be their pastor. A remarkable person. I would not have known him unless I took the time to sit in his living room one afternoon. He has since passed away since I left. Keep going. Okay, I'm going to get some pushback here. Learning a language after age 10 can be very, very difficult. I was required to learn a language beginning at age 59. I was required to learn the language for my work permit. It is not easy. And as I think I told you this story the first week, the youth in my church, at one point, I mean, youth always give you honest feedback, and the youth said, please speak English, your German hurts our ears. But I'm going to push ahead anyway and talk about how important it is and why it's important to learn the language of the other. The person who influenced my thinking more than any other is David I. Smith, and he's written several books where he mentions this, but the one where he develops it most fully is titled Learning from the Stranger, Christian Faith and Cultural Diversity. In other words, moving from mastery, which is where most of us start out with other people, to encounter, right? So just to give you some information or background to David Smith, he started his career teaching French, German, and Russian in secondary schools in the UK. Well, think about that. I think I am not qualified to teach English in secondary schools, and he's teaching several languages. He came to Calvin University, I forget how long ago, and from a Christian point of view, he argues that language learning is one way, maybe the key way, to learn from the stranger. Learning from the stranger is more important to Christian discipleship, this is a direct quote from him, than imparting our knowledge and wisdom with them. He's not the only one. Anybody here familiar with David Smith? Okay. I got him to, since I quoted him extensively, I got him to write an endorsement or a blurb for the back of my book. He's a big guy. Michael Cronin is an Irish academic. He makes the same argument, but not from a Christian point of view. He makes the same argument from an ethical, secular point of view. But in his mind, the way to engage with other human beings is to learn to speak their language. I'm waiting for somebody to be bad. Pico Iyer, I mentioned him last week. He's got a brilliant essay titled The Man Who Speaks 10 Languages. I recommend it to you, as a matter of fact. I think it's the very same argument. How do you understand another person, the way that person looks at the world, unless you learn to speak his or her language? Barbara Kingsolver has written a number of novels. This is not her most well-known, but this novel is about a protagonist who learns Portuguese, and a new world opens up because the protagonist can now speak the language of other Portuguese. Has anyone of you read? What's her most famous? Thank you. I recommend this just for this particular issue. It's all focused on language learning. So, learning another person's language is, it's not just about acquiring a skill, although when I somehow passed my proficiency test, I'm still surprised. But when I somehow passed the proficiency test, I was proud of myself. But the skill is actually secondary to something more important. What learning the language does is it opens a window into another culture, another way of thinking, and another way of speaking. And then, as I mentioned, it's also an act of humility, because if you speak a language poorly, people get it right away. And I think of all the people I've known who immigrated to the United States and who speak English poorly. And but I have put myself in that position in other countries. Okay, I'm going to issue a little challenge to you here. I did just a tiny bit of research and discovered that close to 10,000 of our fellow fellow, I don't know, citizens of Holland, are native speaking, are are Spanish speaking natives, I'm not getting the right way to say that, but they're Hispanic. And that's almost 25% of the population. So when I read a statistic like that, I feel convicted because I've made this much effort to understand the world of the people around me. These are people who do landscaping in my homeowners association. They're the people who stain my deck in the summertime. They speak English to me because I'm helpless unless I'm speaking English. I have made zero effort to understand their world. What do you think about that? I'm still wrestling with how bad I feel over having done so little. I'm going to excuse myself because of my age. But I wonder if Spanish should not be more of a required course in our schools so that our citizens can understand each other and get along better than we. Okay, that was a free editorial, but it underlines the importance of language learning. Here's my story about that. There are 4 official languages in Switzerland. I moved to the northern part of the country, and so German is the official language, although nobody speaks that, they speak Swiss. If I had moved to the western part of the country, Geneva and the area, I would have been required to speak French, southern part, Italian, and then way over on the eastern side, there's a tiny canton where Romansh is spoken, and that's the official language. And the government spends millions of francs keeping Romansh alive. And when students reach high school, they revert to German. But for reasons known only to that culture, they're trying very hard to keep this bit of their history alive. So I learned standard German, Hochdeutsch. And what was frustrating about that is that's not what everybody speaks. All the people around me were speaking Swiss German, which I would describe as a dialect, but that would be deeply offensive to a Swiss person. They think of it as a separate language, not as a dialect. Okay, so I'll tell you how I got there at age 59. I think Duolingo and Babbel, and there are a handful of others, I think they're supplemental tools. I certainly use them. I think they were very good for me for vocabulary and some pronunciation, but I don't think it's going to get anybody to fluency. Sorry. So language classes for me were essential. I lived in a little village outside of Zurich and went to the village school. A young school teacher taught, and she spoke only standard German for the entire, I don't know, 90 minutes that we were there. And she spoke clearly. Her German was beautiful, but all the students, there were only, I don't know, 5 or 6 students, but we were all hanging on every word, trying to understand what she was saying. So taking classes, starting a language group. What I did was to find other expats to have lunch with, and for our lunch hour, we agreed to speak only German to each other. And we would introduce ourselves. Ich heiße Doug. What do you do? Ich bin ein Pfarrer. I'm a pastor. And so anyway, that was our conversation for an hour at lunchtime. Language partner. You can do that by Zoom and different ways. Oh, on my brief train ride into Zurich every day, I listened to Deutsche Welle slow news. So Deutsche Welle, a media outlet in Germany, has something called slow news for language learners. And I would get the day's news, but I would get it at a kindergarten level. And, I'd be, riding all the way into work, listening to the morning news. And then newspapers. Cool. I have a son-in-law who works for Amazon, still has his job at the moment, has gone to Japan a few times for work, And now he and my daughter are going for some major anniversary coming up in live. He never heard my course, but he has joined a Japanese language group. He is determined for their upcoming trip to Japan to know at least the rudimentary parts of the Japanese language. I'll tell you this much: learning German is far easier than learning Japanese or any Asian. Okay, how are we doing? I've got four more to go. Okay, here's the one I'm only partly serious about. Have any of you experienced healthcare in another oh, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Do you dare?
I'm going to say a couple background things. In Holland, Michigan, when I was in elementary school, fifth grade, about fifth grade, the schools decided that part of it was Russian influence, that about Sputnik, they might get ahead of us, but we need more foreign languages in the schools. And so half the schools had Spanish speaking people who would come in and it was conversational Spanish. I happened to be at Jefferson Elementary and we had German. So I learned from about the age 10 and took German all the way through high school, majored in German, minored in Spanish at Hope College, and went to Germany for my junior year abroad. My medical, it wasn't bad problem, but that back then we had hard contact lenses in the early 70s. One popped out in somebody's yard, and I just couldn't find the thing, so I did have to go to an ophthalmologist or an optometrist. And I would share that with my students, and ended up going to Florida teaching German and Spanish. But I would share with it, you have to know your alphabet for sure and your numbers, or you won't get the correct lens in a foreign country. I was able to at least read all of that, and so it was fine.
What language did the doctor speak to you?
Pardon?
Did the doctor speak to you in English?
No.
Oh, okay.
I was fluent German by then.
Good for you.
It was good. I've had a lot of experiences with those, and then I came back with retirement to Holland again after 42 years in Florida, and I was blessed to be able to sing in Italy and in Ireland. We did 2 concert tours, so we met all kinds of wonderful people that were willing to serve us. And I could go on and on about that, but I won't. But 2 times I was able to use Spanish in Italy. Who would think? One time was we had free time, so it looked like just a quick takeout place. It had some stuff in English on it, because I had learned a little bit of Italian just so I could order from a menu or something, those kind of things, just before we went. Okay, so we're in there. My niece went with me, and she has to be gluten-free, or she had major problems. And so I was trying to read. I read it in Italian, what I wanted, and then we couldn't figure out my niece couldn't figure out what to say about what she needed. So, and I didn't know enough Italian, so the person behind the counter went, because she didn't speak English. She said, habla usted español? Because I must have been speaking Italian with a Spanish accent. And so I gave the order in Spanish. And so kept her healthy. On the way back in the Dublin airport, when we were returning, you just would sit. There's all these counters all over the place. I mean, it was a little confusing. You had to follow the signs. And a Spanish-speaking woman was sitting in our little group. And she needed to know something, and so I had to speak to her in Spanish. And if she would have continued to stay with us and be in our line, she would have been going to Chicago. But she was trying to go to Brazil. So I looked at things up for her and told her the right way which counter to go to. Who knew, all that would be that useful.
I'm impressed. Thank you. So my argument here is that this is yet another window into understanding other cultures during my time in Zurich, well, my wife had surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough. I made it a trip to the ER, and I had annual visits with my primary care physician or house arzt. And in my first visit with him, he was taking down medications. So I take a daily vitamin, and he laughed. He said, "You Americans have the most expensive urine in the world." He had he had no use for daily vitamins. Anyways, very very revealing to me. And then one more comment about that. Switzerland has what we would call Obamacare. Everyone is required to purchase their own insurance. The employers don't provide it. You are required to have it. And private insurance companies are required to sell it to you. So I thought all of that was fascinating. I got to experience healthcare as it's provided by other countries. Don't get sick abroad. Do some reading before you go. I'm looking at you, you're HASP scholars, so of course you're going to read before you go someplace, but consider this a further encouragement. When I retired, my wife and I we didn't want to hurry back to Holland in the wintertime, so we went to Morocco for a few weeks, and I thought that reading Edith Wharton's In Morocco would be excellent preparation. She's early feminist, first person to win the Pulitzer Prize in literature for An Age of Innocence, the Age of Innocence. So I was expecting quite a fine book, only to find that I would never recommend this particular book to you. She viewed the Moroccan culture through the colonial lens. I'll show you one brief example of this. So she's traveling around, and she was able to go to the Sultan's harem one day. And that was not on my itinerary, by the way, but she went to the Sultan's harem and saw the Sultan's favorites. So this is how she described them: round-faced, apricot-tinted girls in their teens, with high cheekbones, full red lips, surprised brown eyes between curved up Asiatic lids, and little brown hens fluttering out like birds from their brocaded suits. There was zero appreciation for what was happening within the harem. That I don't think that all the girls in the harem were sex slaves, but there was this vast power differential within the harem that would make me extremely uncomfortable. And yet she writes about it in this colonial. YouTube videos. I can't believe I'm recommending this to you, but there are vloggers. There are thousands and thousands of vloggers, people who film every second of their travel experience. So my story is, I flew into Charles de Gaulle Airport and I wanted to begin my Camino walk in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. But how do you get from the airport gate to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port? Well, never fear. I watched a couple of YouTube videos and somebody filmed himself doing it. And so I knew which train to take, which platform to stand on. I think this can be very, very helpful. Some of you are way ahead of me on this, but there are YouTube videos about every travel destination in the world. And they're often young adults who do these things. Have you noticed them? Yeah. For those of you at home that are at home, they usually live there. I think that's probably true. Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to give you an example of a surprise. I was coming up on my proficiency exam in German, and I was not quite there. So I spent a month in Berlin at the Goethe Institute, just intensive language learning for 1 month. I know it sounds terrible, but it was actually quite a fine experience. But at noon hour, I just couldn't take it anymore. Everybody speaking German, teacher, my fellow students, I had to escape at noon hour. And on my walk, I came across these Stolpersteine, which are brass plates, and they would fit over cobblestones that I'll show you. they would fit over cobblestones in the street, and I had never seen this before, so I knelt down to read more carefully, and because I was taking German, I could translate. So here we have Irma Rosenthal and her two daughters, Carla and Ellen. And they were both, all three of them were deported in 1943, and all three were murdered at Auschwitz. So as it turns out, I'll go back. The German artist Günther Demnig started to commemorate the last place where people lived before they were deported. But these were not only Jews, but predominantly Jews. And since he started this project, more than 100,000 Stolpersteine have been installed all over Europe in a couple dozen countries. It's the world's largest decentralized art location. So I moved back to the US after retirement, but did not forget about these things. I read about them. And then I moved back for an interim in The Hague. And on my walk from my townhouse to the church where I work, I suddenly saw two more. And these are going to be harder to see because I had a fancy camera for the first photo, and I was just using my phone for these. So here's the translation. I mean, these two people would have been my neighbors. Robert Herman and his wife Gertrude Herman. Their date of birth is given, and they were both murdered a month apart at Bergen-Belsen. I have to say that I had never paid much attention to public art before, stumbling upon, no pun intended, stumbling upon the Stolpersteine. But I began, as soon as I recognized them, I began to see them everywhere. And since 6 million Jews were murdered, there are a lot of these around. And Berlin had the highest concentration of Jews in all of Europe before the war. And so there are a lot of Stolpersteine there.
When I was in Paris, I found a plaque on a wall that said, basically, Robert Caron, who was active in the resistance, was gunned down here. And I came home to talk to a Robert Barron, who was my family attorney, and said, I found, he said, oh yeah, that was my uncle.
I was guessing as you were talking about why it was a wall plaque and not a Stolpersteine. Some cities, Munich is the only one I know about, but some cities have said, this is not a way to honor people. It's something you can step on, and that it's no good. So Munich has made its own way to honor victims of the Holocaust, and it's usually a wall plaque. In Paris, maybe one too, I don't know. Okay. At this point, I became very interested in public art and how we remember war and I guess other events. And so does anybody recognize what this is? You've been to Alabama. So it's informally known as the National Lynching Museum. It's in Montgomery, Alabama, 6-acre site overlooking the state capitol. So much like the Stolpersteine, people are remembered by name here. There are columns representing every 800 counties where lynchings took place. And then the names of all the people who were lynched in that county are given on the column. And then where the name is not known, it just says unknown. And if you look at the way this is constructed, the viewer descends. And so you find yourself, when you finally get inside, you find yourself in the position of one of those white Southerners. Well, there wasn't just a sound, but one of those white observers looking up at a dangling body. This is a very powerful example of public art. So then there it is. National Lynching Museum. Michigan. is represented in that museum. There are only a handful of states where no lynching ever took place, but Michigan had some examples there. I'm guessing you'll recognize this one. Vietnam War Memorial, sometimes called a gash in the earth. It's like the Stolpersteine in a way because the names are etched onto granite wall. Not everyone likes this trend in public arts. And so in 1982, long after the wall was completed, no, it was actually 1984, a statue called Three Soldiers, more traditional kind of public art, was installed. And then someone must have said, hey, women served in this war too. And so there's a Vietnam Women's Memorial also nearby. In the years before this kind of public art, what you usually found was a general on horseback, resplendent in uniform. It valorizes war, and over the last 50 or 60 years, public art has changed significantly in the way it remembers war. Here's yet another example. This is in Berlin near the Tiergarten. This is a very moving site too. But unlike the Stolpersteine, you can avoid this. You don't have to go there. And what makes the Stolpersteine so memorable is that they're unavoidable. I'm guessing you all remember this one. Almost 10,000 grave sites at Normandy. And in a way, this was a forerunner, I think, to the kind of public art I've been describing. No generals on horseback here. This, by the way, one of the most moving places in Europe I visited. And then, this is the most moving. I was a pastor in Wheaton, Illinois, and one of the men in the church on the committee that called me to the church, as a matter of fact, turned out to be a 19-year-old soldier in World War II, and he helped to liberate Dhaka. So I got to hear his story, and it wasn't traumatizing, but it affected the rest of his life to come upon this camp. Dachau was the first concentration camp to be built, but it was not built as an extermination camp. And yet 32,000 documented deaths took place there. And the people who were left alive were very sick. I tell too much of this, I'm going to cry. But he said children were being held behind chicken wire, and they were too weak to get out. Once the American soldiers came, they're too weak to I don't know, to fight for their own freedom. So he remembers pulling down the chicken wire so that the children could come out. I'm trying to decide if I can tell this story without. So here's the story. I should have included John in my examples of people whose lives were changed. Before John went to Europe, his mom, of course, tucked the New Testament into his pocket. Mom. But anyway, she tucked the New Testament into his pocket. And the way he tells the story is that once the camp was secured, I don't know exactly what that means, but once they had everything under control, he went off by himself, sat on his helmet, and took this New Testament out of his pocket. And he said his prayer at that moment was, God, help me to use my life in a way so that nothing like this ever happens again. I want to use my life to, so, okay, that's quite a prayer. He came back. I have to finish the story now that I started. He came back to the US and joined the YMCA movement. I knew the YMCA as a swimming club where I learned how to swim. John was a director of the Cleveland YMCA, which in the 1950s became the first YMCA in the United States to have an interracial summer camp. His first step toward making good on this prayer. And he said it was not very popular. There were a lot of people who didn't like the idea very much. And yet, John kept going and went on to be inducted into the YMCA Hall of Fame. He spent his life doing exactly what he said he was going to do, sitting on his helmet at the Dachau concentration camp. there's more to the story, but I'm going to keep it. At the camp, he was just in Patton's Third Army, and they were moving toward Germany, and at Dachau. Well, early on, he was director of Local Y. It was Cleveland. And then as time went on, he became part of the international YMCA. And it was actually through John that I met Father Shakur. I mean, he knew there were YMCAs in Israel. And in fact, when my group was there, we stayed at the Jerusalem YMCA, not the King David Hotel across the street. Yeah, thank you. I didn't understand. Okay, one more part. John came along on my first trip to Israel because he knew Father Shakur. And in Jerusalem, we went to see the Yad Vashem Museum, the Holocaust Museum. John got 20 feet inside the door. There was a big hall with all these photos of people who lost their lives in Holocaust, and he became sick. So as tour host, my job was to walk with him back out to the bus. And it was then that I heard a story for the first time. I don't think he had not gotten into the habit of telling that story, although in subsequent years he began to go to school. Tell history. Okay. I was a senior at Calvin, and I had an opening in the schedule, and I didn't need any more courses for my major. I took an art history class. Totally random. And I think this was one of those things that was life-changing for me. It's called art history, but the truth is it was a history of Western art. But it was amazing. And so I encourage people who visit museums around the world to take a class, do some reading about art history. Make sure you know about the sculpture, the painting you're going to see before you get there. Otherwise, you're going to be like most of the people who see the Mona Lisa and spend 5 or 15 seconds in front of it. And then a recent trend in museums is to carry and what do you call those things? A mobile audio guide. I think they're wonderful, and they don't disturb other people. And you can spend as long as you want in front of a painting or sculpture. I think they're exceptional. So here's my shout out to my college professor, Edgar Beauvais. I think I've spent most of my adult life going to see all the paintings that he introduced me to. It's really remarkable. Here are a couple of examples. On my first weekend in The Hague, I hurried over immediately to the Mauritshuis Museum to see the girl with the pearl earring. And then I discovered that, oh my goodness, there are a lot of famous artists represented here. Vermeer, Rembrandt, and that's a joke. A family joke was that Adrian Brouwer is our uncle. Brouwer is a very common Dutch name. Henry Nouwen, does that name mean anything to you? He's a Dutch priest. He had teaching positions at Notre Dame and then Harvard. And something about his life was deeply unsatisfying. And he remembers seeing a print of this Rembrandt painting. And it affected him very, very deeply. He came back to the US, quit his Harvard teaching job, which I don't think anybody would do lightly, and then went back to Europe. And as it turns out, he spent about 3 days sitting at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg with this painting in front of him. And then he wrote a very moving book called The Return of the Prodigal about his experience. And then he spent the rest of his life working with mentally disabled adults. He still did public speaking, but the rule was, in the order where he was working, the rule was that if you go, you take your adult with you, the one you're caring for. So he would give a lecture on a stage, and the adult he was caring for would be sitting right behind him in a chair. And that was how he traveled around and continued his speaking career. Henry Nouwen, a remarkable man. This is my last piece of art to show you. This is the Eisenheim altarpiece by Grunewald. Okay, the funny part of this story is my wife wanted to go see the Christmas markets in Colmar. And I thought, oh yeah, I would love to go to Colmar because the Eisenheim altarpiece is there. So she can go shopping in the Christmas markets and I'm going to see this painting. The story is Karl Barth, famous Swiss theologian, had this print hanging in his office. And whenever people came to see him, he would always say, I want to be that finger. So John the Baptist was dead by the time of the crucifixion, as you know, but here he is because an artist can do whatever he or she wants. John the Baptist is in the painting and he's pointing this impossibly long and bony finger at Jesus. And Karl Barth would tell visitors, I want to be that finger. So I think the last museum stop when we were living in Europe was in the Colmar region of France, and I got to see this find. Okay. One last one. My book begins with the suggestion that this urge to move around and leave home and see stuff is spiritual in nature. And then in the last chapter, I come back to it. I think at base or at root, we have a longing for home. And there's a wonderful, I'm not going to read this quote for you. I'll give you a shorter one. St. Augustine. Because God has made us for himself, our hearts are restless until they rest. I think I know that restlessness. This is from his confession, memoir, and I think I understand that restlessness. I've had that much of my life. And I think it's a spiritual restlessness, at least that's what I argue in the book. And then I came across a German word, which, would you pronounce that for me?
Sehnsucht.
I'm not going to embarrass myself by doing it. So this word is a recurring theme in German literature, Faust, even in Rilke's poetry. But musicians too have taken on this word. Most translations of German works leave this word in its original German. It has such a particular meaning that it can't be rendered into English, except C.S. Lewis once tried. And I think this is beautiful. This is basically what I'm going to leave you with. There is an inconsolable longing in the human heart for we know not what. I think it's a spiritual longing. C.S. Lewis did too. Here's Rilke who wrote about the same topic. I'm going to plow through that. I have to insert one joke here. This is a famous quote by Hunter Thompson. I think it's funny, but I do not recognize this as a way to live. Life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, wow, what a ride. Well, Hunter Thompson died in his late 60s from alcoholism and drug abuse. That's not how I think about living. Right? I do have one last slide. There's a hymn, and I can't pronounce his last name, but I corresponded with his widow to get permission to print the hymn in my book. I think this expresses what my belief is, that every stage of life is an adventure, and that at the end of life, there is one more surprise, one more adventure. And I have no evidence that that's true, but that's a statement of. Have any of you sung this before? Yes, Minnesota, he's a Minnesota composer. What is it? I'm forgetting the title of it. I was there to hear your morning cry. All right, I didn't leave more than 2 minutes, but we've been talking a little bit too. Anything? Yep.
To go back to beginning to travel, if you're going to do a foreign country and you still have a grandchild young enough, I don't know how old your grandchildren are, but mine are mostly grown. Take a kid about 10 with you, or maybe just a little bit younger. You're going to find all kinds of things and talk to all kinds of people you would never, ever encounter otherwise.
And to see the experience through their eyes too. Yeah. I love that.
Rhodes Scholar has amazing grandparent programs.
I have known people who've done that and they actually let the kids decide where the trip is going to be to. Scares me a little. Okay, thank you, friends. I've enjoyed, you've indulged me.